Sometimes you have to see to believe. Sometimes waiting isn't an option. When the news is breaking, watch with the newsroom of the Washington Post. We explain what's happening and why it matters. Thank you for choosing to watch the headlines as they're being written with our journalists. You can subscribe with a special offer, an entire year of the Washington Post for $29. Go to washingtonpost.com/watch. Subscribing through that link lets everyone here, from the front lines to the control room, know that you care about our continued efforts to inform the public, protect the First Amendment, and foster a healthy democracy. We could not do this without you.
Everybody has saw this video. What we want to know is, will we see justice?
I believe I witnessed a murder. I felt the need to call the police on the police.
Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony. Find the defendant guilty. Verdict count 2, guilty. Verdict count 3, guilty.
We frame this moment for all of us, not just for George Floyd. This is a victory for those who champion humanity over inhumanity.
We find out today how long former police officer Derek Chauvin may spend in jail. Judge Peter Cahill will decide Chauvin's sentence for the murder of George Floyd. The judge already made a ruling this morning denying Chauvin's motion for a new trial. This is a Washington Post special report. I'm Libby Casey. Welcome. A Minnesota jury convicted Chauvin in April of murder and manslaughter, but under Minnesota law, Chauvin will be sentenced only on the most serious charge of second-degree murder. We have a team of reporters across the country, and we'll start now in Minneapolis, where Holly Bailey joins me from the Hennepin County Courthouse. Holly, walk us through what we're expecting there today.
Well, essentially what we're expecting is first to hear some oral arguments from both prosecutors and Derek Chauvin's attorney on their request for sentencing. As you mentioned, Derek Chauvin is going to be sentenced on the harshest thing he was convicted on, which was second-degree murder. Last month, Judge Cahill agreed with prosecutors that he was eligible for a tougher sentence in this. He particularly, in this ruling, cited Chauvin's cruelty towards George Floyd. He cited Floyd's agony in the final minutes before he lost the pulse and was later pronounced dead. And so he is essentially looking at a tougher sentence that could be, a maximum of 40 years in prison. Prosecutors are asking for 30 years, while Derek Chauvin's attorney actually is asking for just probation, which is something that most observers think is not going to happen, but I expect we're going to hear Chauvin's attorney expound on that.
How significant is it that the judge started the day already by saying no, there would not be a new trial? It's something we expected to be argued and discussed today, but that's already been dealt with by the judge.
Yeah, my understanding from sources close to the case is that Judge Cahill had indicated early on that he didn't want to have extended oral arguments on some of these things that Chauvin's attorney had issued in court. One of the things he also cited was he wanted to have a hearing on, possible juror misconduct, looking into what jurors were discussing behind closed doors as they were, considering the verdict. But Judge Cahill denied all of those motions. So it seems like we're going to jump right into the sentencing. And one thing that we're also going to see today is we're expecting to hear from 4 members of George Floyd's family who are expected to speak about 3 to 5 minutes each. They're not going to be allowed under Minnesota law to address Derek Chauvin directly, but rather they're going to tell the judge what all of this, what they've been through, and what the effect on their family has been. And then after that, when we're expecting to hear, Judge Cahill will give Derek Chauvin a chance to say something. We're not sure if he will, but he will have that opportunity, and then Judge Cahill will render the sentence.
So, Holly, talk to us about that possibility of hearing from Derek Chauvin. There's also a pending federal case. How might that, coming down the pike, affect Chauvin and his lawyer deciding whether or not he should speak today?
I mean, that is the open question, and that's why many people think that Derek Chauvin won't say anything. I think many people will remember Derek Chauvin opted not to testify in his own defense at the trial. He has not ever said anything publicly, has never expressed remorse for Floyd's killing. And now he is facing, along with the other three officers who have been implicated in George Floyd's death, federal charges with a case they've been charged with violating George Floyd's federal civil rights. And also Derek Chauvin is also facing a separate charge of violating the federal civil rights of a 14-year-old boy who he allegedly hit with a flashlight and restrained in a way similar to the way he handled George Floyd. And so I think a lot of people believe that because of this pending litigation, that Derek Chauvin fears that anything he could say might be used against him. But again, we could see there are some people who think that there's a slim line of where he could say something. But again, we just really don't know what's going to happen.
So, Holly, Chauvin has been behind bars since the verdict. What do we know about his situation?
He's been held at a state prison outside the Twin Cities. Since his conviction 2 months ago, he's been held in solitary confinement. We actually got to see him in jail a few weeks ago when he was arraigned on the federal charges. He appeared via Zoom. We saw him sitting in a jail cell. And we know this morning that he was transferred back here to Minneapolis, where he's been held at the Hennepin County Jail ahead of this hearing. One of the open questions is whether Chauvin might be rendered over into federal custody since the federal case is now proceeding. There were some documents filed in the federal case that suggested he would be placed in federal detention very soon. Whether that will happen today, we don't know.
So, Holly, you wrote that Derek Chauvin's trial was one of the most important moments of the century for justice in America. What part does today's sentencing play in that chapter?
I think when you talk to people who closely watched this case, they talked about the guilty verdict being just one part of the justice. On one hand, it was called a historic moment, and it was, because so few police officers are ever convicted of an on-duty killing. And so, but now people are watching very, very closely to see what kind of sentence he might get. There's some people fearful that Judge Cahill might sentence him along the lower end of the spectrum, which would be about 12 and a half years. And they think that's not enough. But, if you look at Judge Cahill's ruling on the aggregating factors that merited a tougher sentence, I think that in some ways that was sort of the first tell of what Judge Cahill has been thinking about this case. He's been very quiet and very careful not to, give a tip his hand to any of his opinions in this case. But the language he used to describe Derek Chauvin's treatment of George Floyd, the cruelty, he wrote at length about this and said that Derek Chauvin should have known better and should have known what he was doing and known that he was putting George Floyd in danger when he knelt on him for that long, and that he ignored his cries. And that was sort of the first tip of the hand that Judge Cahill of how he's been viewing this case. And so I expect that we're going to hear Judge Cahill expand on this a little bit more today. But Judge Cahill's strong language in that ruling has led many to believe he's going to go on the tougher end of the spectrum for the sentencing.
Well, my guest, Holly, is at the courthouse. Holly, we saw so much security during the trial. There was a lot of tension. Of course, also those COVID procedures as well. So what is it like there now, just these few months later?
It's a different world. In fact, it's a bit surreal in some ways. I mean, 2 months ago, I stood outside the courthouse here. There were National Guard troops on the streets. There was a giant fence around the courthouse. There were barriers. It was just kind of like a militarized zone. And as I arrived here today, there's a clock tower that sits above Minneapolis City Hall, and it's been chiming out these kind of unusual chimes. They were playing, a lot of hymnals earlier, and just sort of, people are a lot more relaxed. There's not a lot of police out here. There are some people gathered in advance of the sentencing. But aside from the throngs of national media who are back here on the scene, it's just a different world. In some ways, you wouldn't even know that such a momentous hearing was taking place today.
Wow. Holly Bailey. Well, thank you so much, Holly, joining us from the Hennepin County Courthouse, where she's covering today's proceedings. Thank you so much. Let's go now to my guests, Rhonda Colvin, Mary Beth Albright, and James Homan, and they'll be with us for the duration today. A reminder that at 2:30 Eastern Time, that's 1:30 in Minnesota, we expect Judge Cahill to begin the proceedings. Rhonda, let's start with you and just have you reflect on what we heard from Holly. We haven't heard, we heard a lot from Judge Cahill during the trial as he administered the proceedings, but we haven't heard from Judge Cahill, as Holly points out, on his opinion in the case, right? He was aiding the jury in rendering their verdict and getting their opinion of this case. What will you be listening for today from the judge?
Well, what we know about Judge Cahill from watching the jury selection process, watching the duration of the trial, is that he runs a tight ship. And this does look like it's going to be a very straightforward hearing that we are expecting shortly. The people who know Judge Cahill have talked about how he is popular among the legal community there in Hennepin County. He did serve as a defense lawyer and a prosecutor, so he kind of gets both ends of the spectrum. And from what Holly said about how he found aggravating factors in this case, he is setting up potentially to give Chauvin a longer sentence. And so that's what's going to be so interesting today, to hear what is behind his decision making. What were the factors that he feels warrants the length of sentencing that he is going to bring forward? And it really will be interesting to hear him speak at length. You're right, we have not heard his opinion at all. He has been very much a judge wanting to have order in this whole trial. And it appears that he's going to do the same moments from now when we see him.
Mary Beth, what does the judge base his decision on here? What power does he have at this phase of justice?
Libby, it's Judge Cahill's sole power to decide what the ramifications are for Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd. That's what's at stake today. We are going to find out, as a country, as a world, what are the consequences of Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd. And that will tell us a lot about, it's going to have people reacting, as Holly said, and as Rhonda said, to whether it's 12 and a half years, whether it's 30 years, which is what the state asks for. It's going to be a big day because we've seen the impact of that murder around the world. We've seen the impact of that murder on our cities. Today, we find out what the impact of that murder is on Derek Chauvin. And of course, as everyone has mentioned, this is only part of it, right? These are the state charges. These are the state murder charges. There's a whole other case going on at the Department of Justice, which says that Derek Chauvin violated George Floyd's civil rights, constitutional civil rights. So that has to be litigated on the federal level. So we're still waiting for what that consequence should be. But today we find out what the state consequences will be.
You know, Mary Beth, I want to talk about that federal case in a moment, because it is important to help all of us, determine what's going on and distinguish between those two proceedings. But I'd like to hear more from you about just what the judge is going to weigh today as he considers the sentence. Now, we heard from Holly that we do anticipate hearing members of George Floyd's family speak about their loss. As she pointed out, they'll address the judge, not Derek Chauvin. We don't know if we'll hear from Derek Chauvin, but there's already been a lot of paperwork filed in this. So what does the judge consider?
So the judge considers a number of factors because, as I said before, it's his decision and his decision alone what the sentence will be, as long as that sentence is lawful. It goes with the law. So I have here just one page of a many page. It's the sentencing guidelines for the state of Minnesota. So many state legislatures have done this. They've decided, hey, we're going to pass some guidelines for how judges should sentence people. We don't want them just going wherever they want to. We're going to give a check and a balance to this, right? So the state legislature in Minnesota passed guidelines to say, if you're convicted of second-degree murder, here's what we think you should get. Here's the suggested sentence. And as Holly was saying earlier, the suggested sentence for somebody with zero criminal record, which is very important. That's part of the grid, right? We're looking at this grid. This is somebody's criminal record. You get a point for everything that you've done that has been against the law up until your conviction. So Derek Chauvin has a zero criminal record. So the base sentence would be 12 and a half years for second-degree murder. However, as Holly noted and Rhonda noted, we have a 6-page decision from Judge Cahill saying why he thinks that there should be an aggravated sentence, because there were children around, because it was a particular abuse of authority, and interestingly, because there were 3 other people involved. So it's sort of like a crime with a lot of people. As opposed to this morning, what Judge Cahill just said to the motion for a new trial is just denied. You know, it's 2 pages in response to a 64-page brief from Chauvin's lawyer, and in response to a 77-page brief from the state. So I agree, it's really a shot across the bow from Chauvin's law, from Judge Cahill about how he's feeling about this case. I would expect to be very close to 30 years.
James Homan, let's go to you to join this conversation. I want you to tease apart for our viewers what's at stake here at the state level with this sentence, and also the federal case against not just Derek Chauvin, but those 3 other officers.
Absolutely, Libby. And it's important to keep in perspective the historicness of today. This is the first time in the 160 some odd year history of Minnesota that a white police officer is being sentenced for murder of someone while on duty. Chauvin was the first white officer convicted for killing a black person in the line of duty, and now he will be sentenced for that. So on the one hand, there is justice in this case, but it's not done yet because there are these federal charges, not just against Derek Chauvin, but against the 3 other former Minneapolis police officers who were also there. Now, 2 of those 3 officers were literally on their first week on the job. Originally, the 3 other officers were going to go on trial in August. Now, because the Biden Justice Department under Attorney General Merrick Garland have brought federal charges, those state prosecutions have been pushed back to at least next March. So it's going to be a while before we have kind of resolution on those other cases. But it was Derek Chauvin who put his knee on George Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes, and this jury of his peers concluded that they weren't going to buy the arguments that have gotten a lot of other police officers found not guilty for somewhat similar conduct in the past.
Let's go now to Minneapolis, where Washington Post reporter Joyce Coe joins us from outside Cup Foods at the location that is now named George Floyd Square. Joyce, describe what things are like there right now as we await this sentencing, and tell us about what you're hearing there on the ground.
Well, Libby, I am standing just steps away from the site where George Floyd took his last breaths as Derek Chauvin's knee was on his neck for those 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And really, this square has turned into a memorial for blocks. And I was here for the verdict when the verdict came down. And it's interesting because today things are a lot quieter than they were that day back on April 20th. Where we saw thousands of people gathered here in this square. I want you to take a look at some of this memorial space that has been created by community members who have really just, for a while there, this square was blocked off to basically just pedestrians only. Throughout the day, we have seen some cars come through, and that is because the city has opened this up to cars to be able to move through here and for traffic to be able to really use this area, which has, of course, been a point of contention for some activists. I did also get a chance to catch up with Benjamin Crump yesterday, who is, of course, the Floyd family's attorney. And I asked him how they are feeling going into today, which, of course, is a very heavy day, hugely consequential and historic, as James mentioned. And he said that they are doing okay, that he felt, cautious to be hopeful because of what has happened historically in these police involved cases. But he did say that he was anticipating sort of emotionally bracing for today. And when I asked him, what would you like to see as far as sentencing goes, he said that he would like to see what the prosecution is asking for, which is 30 years in this case, that he would be satisfied with that. But he did also mention to me, really reminded me of Amber Geiger, the officer in the Botham Jean case, who got 10 years for killing Botham Jean in that case, really using that as an example of a reason why he's not getting his hopes up, you could say, for a long sentence. So there's a lot of cautious optimism here, and things are pretty quiet here for the time being. We do expect, speaking of the Floyd family, to hear them in court later today prior to the sentencing, and we should also expect to hear them come out and speak to the press in a press conference following the sentencing. Libby?
All right, thank you so much, Joyce Coe. Mary Beth, talk us through the process today, what we will expect to hear, what should we be listening for as this unfolds?
Yeah, so today's sentencing hearing, just turned into just a sentencing hearing, right? Because before there were post-verdict motions that Derek Chauvin's attorney filed for a new trial and for a hearing to see if there was juror misconduct. All of those, as I said before, were denied. They were denied in a very terse 2-page decision that just said deny. There were no facts involved, anything like that. So Judge Cahill has specifically said no arguments about that. Okay, so what happens at a sentencing hearing is that Derek Chauvin will come in. He will be wearing civilian clothes. That was approved by the court. It has to be approved by the court because he's a convicted murderer. So usually they come in whatever they're wearing in prison. And so Derek Chauvin will come in. We will see him for the first time the past 2 months. That will be a big deal. And then the state and the defense will get up and give brief oral arguments about what they believe the sentence should be, what they believe Derek Chauvin's consequences should be. The state has asked for 30 years, which is the highest sentence that you can possibly give on second-degree murder for somebody who has a 0 criminal record. Remember, we talked about the sentencing guidelines. Right here, there's your criminal point. Right here, there's a crime, and it's literally a grid. He doesn't have to follow that, but it's highly recommended that he follow that and follow the letter of the law here. So Derek Chauvin's attorney will get up and he is only going to speak to the sentencing. He has asked for probation for Derek Chauvin, for jail time already served, no future prison time, right? So if Derek Chauvin's request is granted, he would be a free man tomorrow. Very few people expect that to happen because of the way that Cahill has addressed the aggravating factors of this case. Then we're going to see members of the Floyd family speak. It might be 1, it might be 3, we're not sure yet. And then there's a time for Derek Chauvin to speak. This is really interesting, and everyone should keep their eye on this because this is a time everyone who has been convicted of a crime has an opportunity to give a statement before they are sentenced. This is a constitutional right, right? It's called an allocution. Derek Chauvin, a lot of people are saying they don't expect him to give an allocution today. Usually when you're defending someone and they're about to be sentenced, there is no downside to an allocution, right? Because they can just say, I am very sorry. They can show remorse for the effect nationally. They can say, I'll never do something like this again. And then the judge would take that into an account. We are thinking, we don't know, obviously, but a lot of experts think that Derek Chauvin will not give an allocution today, which is pretty unusual in a sentencing hearing for the person who's been convicted not to speak at all. And then Judge Cahill will give a sentence. It's highly unusual for the judge not to give a sentence on the same day as a sentencing hearing. He will also be looking at the post-sentencing investigation. That's usually done by a probation officer looking into Derek Chauvin's background, his family support, his place in the community, that kind of thing, to see if that should reduce or increase his sentence. So we'll probably see a little bit about the post-sentencing investigation as well. Although at this point, there's a lot we know about Derek Chauvin, so I'm not sure that there's going to be any big surprises in that post-sentencing report. Libby?
Thank you. James, what would be the significance of hearing from Derek Chauvin in terms of just, trying to get into his mind and understand what he was thinking that day? Because so much of the case that we saw litigated a couple of months ago was about his actions. And because he chose not to testify, which is totally his right, we didn't get in any insight into the mind of Derek Chauvin. We did hear from some jurors that they frankly would have liked to have heard from him. And that's been something that Chauvin's lawyer has said, I'm gonna raise a question about that because it's within his right not to testify. But what would it mean to finally hear from him today?
It means a lot. I think he owes not just an explanation, but also an apology. The members of the four members of the Floyd family who are going to speak aren't allowed to address him directly legally, but of course, they're going to be addressing him and what he did. The only little shards that we have, Libby, are what we saw during the trial when there was some body camera footage that was introduced of Chauvin talking to his sergeant right after the incident and talking to the the elderly gentleman who was on the scene and kind of yelled at Chauvin afterwards, and so we really haven't gotten deep into Chauvin's state of mind, but this is someone who was, sanctioned by the people, a representative of the people, a representative of the state, who has now been convicted for abusing his authority as a police officer. And I think that there's a lot of suspense going into today because it is so unusual for someone not to take advantage of this right to say something for themselves. And it also, it could hurt him in terms of the sentencing here. It cuts both ways. On the one hand, he doesn't want to imperil his position and make it harder to defend himself against federal charges. On the other hand, if he shows no remorse at all, Judge Cahill will certainly take that into account. Judge Cahill is a former prosecutor. He was actually, Amy Klobuchar was the Hennepin County attorney before she became a U.S. senator. He was her deputy, and so he's someone who's kind of the system and has been in the system, has seen both, been on both sides of the bench. And so I can imagine that he would, punish is a strong word, but certainly not be pleased if Chauvin chooses not to say something for himself.
Well, one of the striking parts of the trial was the number of police officers and former colleagues of Derek Chauvin who took the stand for the prosecution. So let's watch as that so-called blue wall of silence fell.
Once the subject is handcuffed and no longer resisting?
Yes.
At that point, the restraint should stop.
Yeah.
A neck restraint is compressing one or both sides of the neck using an arm or leg. But what we train is using one arm or two arm to do a neck restraint.
And how does this differ?
I don't know what kind of improvised position that is. So that's not what we train.
If your knee is on a person's neck, that can kill him.
I absolutely agree. That violates our policy.
That last witness you saw there was the Minneapolis police chief, Medaria Arredondo, and that was Derek Chauvin's boss, Rhonda Colvin. It was very significant to see those officers criticize and condemn what Derek Chauvin did. Walk us through the other elements of this case that solidified the guilty verdicts for that jury.
That's right. And the clips that you just showed, that really just illustrates how significant this case is. When it was going through the trial phase, all of these witnesses, you had veteran officers who were part of the MPD. You had Chauvin's boss. You had the training officer who said that he did an improvised move, saying she didn't recognize what he was doing. It all put a spotlight on Derek Chauvin as sort of this bad apple, and they did not support him. But that's not what we have seen before in cases like this. And again, to talk about the significance of today in this sentencing we're awaiting, it's really important to think about that there's a low conviction rate for officers who commit murder while on the job. I was looking at some data, and there's a Bowling Green State University professor who tracks the conviction rate of officers. And over the last 15-year period, only 11 officers who have committed murder while on the job have been convicted. So that also adds a little bit more significance to the day that there was a conviction, and now there's going to be a sentence that is likely a long one. But there were other witnesses too who spoke out over the course of the trial. I know everyone remembers when the young woman who filmed the encounter between Chauvin and Floyd, she just won a Pulitzer citation, Darnella Frazier, for that work and what it led to. But a lot of those witness testimonies, from what we've heard from the jurors who have spoken out, they were really pivotal. And one of the witnesses on the stand for the prosecution that was really pivotal turned out to be Dr. Tobin. He was the pulmonologist who described seeing the moment when George Floyd died, that he's a breathing expert, a world-renowned breathing expert, and he could see the moment when life left George Floyd. So all of these things together, all of these witnesses, there were 45 in total during the trial, they really had an impact and really led to a very unprecedented conviction on 3 counts of Derek Chauvin.
Well, Nicole Ellis, our colleague, has been speaking with experts about how Black communities are processing not only today's sentencing, but the tense months that led up to this as we all rewatch the graphic videos of George Floyd dying. And people watch that over and over again. So, Nicole, thanks for joining our show. How are people grappling with this moment?
Thanks, Libby. I mean, you make a really good point. Many of the people that I've spoken to saw themselves in George Floyd. And while we all know that this case and the sentencing is all about one specific instance, he's really taken on this sort of proxy role for people who look like him, who have children, husbands, wives, relatives who have his skin tone, all with this deeply personal awareness that he's not the first Black person to die in police custody. So I talked to a mental health expert to kind of get more insight on this, and here's what she had to say.
For Black people, you see yourself as a George Floyd with the knee on your neck. You see yourself as a Sandra Bland going to a job interview. And so what America saw, what the world saw, was the spirit and the soul of a man representing all of us, being eked out by the state, and at the pleas of so many people, children who had to see this.
What are the factors that contribute to why this is tiring for Black people?
You can do everything right. You can have a job, you can get educated, you can do all of the right things that we're told to do to achieve the American dream. But in this country, as a Black person, none of that will protect you.
So you just heard from Jamita Barlow, an academic scholar and mental health expert, who mentioned not only George Floyd, but also Sandra Bland, who in 2015 made headlines when she was partially filmed being arrested at a traffic stop and was found dead 3 days later in her jail cell, also an African-American woman and was 28 years old. So Libby, as we watch the Minnesota court today, there are a lot of American communities with their own fresh wounds, and that will be searching for justice and a clarity of understanding around how our justice system works and whether or not it does work for Black people. Back to you, Libby.
Nicole Ellis, thank you so much for joining us. Let's go now this afternoon to our panel of guests, Rhonda Colvin, Mary Beth Albright, and James Homan. They're with us for the next half hour as we await at 2:30 Eastern Time, 1:30 local time in Minnesota, this sentencing hearing to begin. You know, Rhonda, we've been talking about just how remarkable it is that this case, frankly, proceeded, that a conviction was reached on all three charges. And now that we're in the sentencing phase and we have indications from the judge that he does find that there are additional factors to consider that may boost the sentence that Derek Chauvin faces. All of this has led to a lot of questions and a lot of conversations across the country about policing. And a big part of that conversation is right here in Washington, where you and I are. Let's talk about the federal efforts at police reform.
Yeah, so the federal efforts of police reform, it started very swiftly after George Floyd died last summer. The House Democrats and the Congressional Black Caucus came together and put together a bill to address some of the issues that we're seeing over and over again. The bill included things like creating a national registry to flag problematic officers who have been fired or let go for misconduct, but then they may move to another state or city, and that city and those people hiring have no idea what their history was like. So the bill would address that. It would address standardizing federal training that the DOJ would put forward, where every police department would go through the same type of training. It also would ban chokehold. So it had some parts of it that were widely accepted by both Republicans and Democrats. But of course, there was an issue of qualified immunity, which is a protection for government officials and officers to protect them from liability in misconduct. And that was something Republicans said last year was a no-go for them, that if that was in the bill, they weren't going to support it. And that ended negotiations last summer. But now, as of last night, we heard from the three main congressional negotiators on the issue, Karen Bass in the House, Cory Booker in the Senate, and Tim Scott in the Senate, have been working and talking behind the scenes on a police reform effort. And they announced last night that they have come together on an agreement for a framework of the bill. So that is somewhat significant, but the bill itself, they are still working on and finalizing. And in their statement, they said in the coming weeks, they hope to move a proposal to the floor and into the debate phase. So that's sort of what we know right now about where police reform is on the Hill. It's something that we've seen the Floyd family visit DC on a couple occasions in the last few months, visiting the White House, visiting the Hill, talking to lawmakers about the need for police reform.
Rhonda, we did have that breaking news last night, as you said, of this potential framework. You've been talking to lawmakers all through this process. So what are they saying now about the potential to have the breakthrough?
Well, this morning I spoke with Democratic Congresswoman from Florida, Val Demings. She is the former police chief of Orlando, Florida. And so I really want to get her insight on what this agreement might mean. She said she is certainly anticipating it. She did not know what they had agreed to. And again, really only the negotiators know what the agreement was. They have not announced that yet. But I also asked her about sort of the confluence of this happening in the same week where we've had President Biden announce an anti-crime bill, anti-crime plan rather, that he wants to see Congress move forward on issues that might help stem some of this violence that we're seeing this summer, increases in violence certainly across the country in major cities. And I asked her about the politics. What's the political reality of something passing, a police reform bill at the same time where you have people on the Hill wanting to pass anti-crime measures? And here's what she had to say.
If you really want to support the police, then like I said, everybody counts, but everybody's accountable. Good police officers want us to hire the brightest and the best, because those are the men and women working beside the officers that are there. Make sure they have the best equipment, make sure they're properly trained, make sure they look at their policies and have an opportunity to correct their own brokenness. That's something I've said to many police chiefs and sheriffs during the last year is don't wait on legislation to fix your own brokenness. Look within your agencies at your own policies and do it yourself. And so this is a time, the bottom line, we cannot play politics. This is about the safety of those good police officers who are out there that need the support. This is about the safety of our communities, making sure that people are treated with dignity and respect.
And she also makes a point that's pretty important right now. We are seeing a lot of state legislatures and city councils across America decide to take up police reform at the local level. That's been happening at certainly at a faster pace than the police reform talks on the Hill. But she says that, yes, Democrats and Republicans can come together and work on anti-crime measures at the same time of bringing this police reform debate to the floor.
Thanks so much, Rhonda. James, turning to you, how pivotal do you see this entire case, as well as the sentencing phase, frankly, to the larger national conversation that we're having right now?
Well, Libby, without this case, we wouldn't be having this conversation, is the sad reality, or it would be happening, but there wouldn't be a lot of mind share around it in Washington. The reason that the negotiators put out the statement they did last night is to coincide with today's sentencing hearing. And the truth is, based on what I'm hearing, they kind of overstated where they actually are, because both sides recognize that there is a desire for reform, that there's a desire for systemic change, that policing itself needs to improve. And so they put out this statement saying, we have an agreement in principle, but they also said in the same statement, nothing is final until everything is final. And when you ask both Republicans and Democrats, what about qualified immunity? They don't have a solution to that yet. That has been the holdup the entire time, which is, how do you hold police officers accountable if they break the law while on duty? And right now there's a Supreme Court decision that makes it really hard to prosecute or to sue police officers. And Democrats want to get rid of it. Republicans don't. They haven't figured that out. That continues to be the biggest obstacle to actually getting anything done. But to your question, Libby, this whole trial has created all these deadlines. Joe Biden said, let's pass a bill by the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. That deadline slipped. And now, there was a lot of desire to do something by the sentencing. That deadline has slipped. We're going into a 2-week recess right now. Then we're going to come back for 2 weeks where there's going to be a lot of infrastructure maneuvering. And then all of a sudden you get the month-long August recess. So the window is pretty narrow to actually get something through. There's a desire to get there, but the two parties are actually pretty still far apart, considering how galvanizing this was nationally last summer.
Well, let's go back now to Minneapolis and our colleague Joyce Koh. She's reporting from George Floyd Square. So Joyce, tell us about the scene there and also the significance of the very spot you're standing in.
Well, Libby, we are right outside of Cup Foods, and this is the scene where everything started. This site has really become a gathering place for the community. It has drawn countless visitors to honor not just George Floyd's life, but the countless Black and brown people in America that have died at the hands of police. Just over my shoulder, you'll see flowers and signs and roped off areas, murals, and all of this is really to remember the life of George Floyd and really the spot where he lost his life. Just over my shoulder, you see where George Floyd spent his last few minutes on earth as a group of witnesses really gathered around him in his final moments on the sidewalk that you see behind me. I want you to take a look at this photograph. This is a still image from the police body camera footage that was shown as an exhibit in court. And you'll see the witnesses, many of whom spoke during the trial, and in particular, Darnella Frazier, who is to the right of the picture in the blue pants, standing next to the very young 9-year-old girl who was her cousin. And Darnella Frazier was only 17 years old at the time that she witnessed this. She is largely the reason why we know the truth of what happened that day to George Floyd. She was the one who took the cell phone footage, this really citizen journalism that we saw that took that cell phone footage and stood there and recorded the entire exchange as she happened upon this altercation between police and George Floyd as she was walking into the Cup Foods that I am standing in front of. And the reason why this spot is significant is not just, the last place where George Floyd took his last few breaths, but it's really been the start of the movement. I mean, here we were talking to some activists earlier this morning who said that despite the fact that the city has reopened this street up to traffic and cars, which was not the case just a couple of months ago, they want to keep this space sacred. They want to keep this as a place of remembrance for not just George Floyd, but other people that have lost their lives at the hands of police. And they really want to use this place, this entire street, and that stretches for several blocks in every direction, as a place of education, as a place where people can gather and push the conversation forward. So in talking to activists here, they say, today is significant, of course, because it is the sentencing, but it will also be the start of many changes that they hope they will see in the days and years to come. Libby?
Joyce Coe, thank you so much. Let's listen to one of the powerful moments from the trial. This is the testimony of teenage witness Darnella Frazier.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen how your viewing, experiencing what happened to George Floyd has affected your life?
When I look at George Floyd, I look at my dad, I look at my brothers, I look at my cousins, my uncles, because they are all Black. I have a Black father, I have a Black brother, I have Black friends. And I look at that and I look at how that could have been one of them. It's been nights. I stayed up apologizing and apologizing to George Floyd for not doing more and not physically interacting.
That's the voice of Darnella Frazier from the trial that concluded in April. Rhonda, we didn't see her because she was a minor at the time, and it is so hard to hear her reflect on what that experience was for her. And, so many of those witnesses, their testimony was so powerful because you could just see how devastated and torn up they were by not being able to do more to help George Floyd. Those moments made an impression on the jury. They surely made an impression on the judge. We'll also be hearing today in front of the judge from George Floyd family members. And so, you can't help but take into account the personal toll of murder. There's the guidelines, there's the numbers. Mary Beth was talking about sort of the charts of looking at people's past behavior. But at the end of the day, this is the story of a man whose life was lost, Rhonda.
That's right. And we've routinely heard from one of George Floyd's brothers, Philonis Floyd. He's sort of been the family spokesperson. But today we might hear from a couple other people who are friends or family of George Floyd. And I think when we think back at all of those witness testimonies and what we know now, what we've heard from jurors who have spoken out, those witnesses really made everything. They really changed minds. They brought in a humanizing component to this trial. You can't help but identify with Darnella Frazier, even if she's discussing how, as a Black child, she's putting her self into this and seeing him as a family member. But any human being can understand the trauma that might be associated from watching someone die. And she was a child when that happened. And not only her, there were a couple other minors there on the scene as well. There was a minor who worked in the store, a high school student who came out to the sidewalk and saw things. There was the 9-year-old cousin of Darnella Frazier who's also there. So those things in hindsight, and when the history books are written about the George Floyd trial, I think the witness testimony, the eyewitness testimony, was such a compelling part of all of this and may have really changed things.
Let's go now back to Minneapolis and our guest, Tolu Olorunipa, who is reporting live from on the scenes, who is joining us by phone. Thank you so much for joining us. We were just talking about the Floyd family, and Tolu, you've been, part of your reporting has been looking at the life of George Floyd. What's on your mind today as you prepare to report on this sentencing?
Yeah, we will be really watching to see what the judge says and what kind of sentence the police officer gets. The family does believe that they've gotten some form of justice in the fact that Officer Chauvin was found guilty on all of the counts that he was tried for, but they are still holding out hope that he will be sentenced. George Floyd's friends and family want Officer Chauvin to be sentenced in alignment with the life that he took. They want him to get a sentence that gives value to the life that was lost on May 25th, 2020. And I'll really be watching to see how the judge comes to their determination over how much time to give Derek Chauvin, and whether or not this does end up feeling like justice for the family. They obviously feel that true justice would be having their brother, their father, their nephew still with them, still here, living and breathing. But short of that, they do want to make sure that the officer that took Floyd's life will be held accountable and will have to face the consequences of that, just like any other person who murders someone, especially in cold blood, in front of a crowd, in front of cameras, in front of young people. So I'll be watching very closely to see how the judge weighs the various factors that are at play, and whether or not, this very rare instance in which we see a police officer not only found guilty, but having to sit before a judge and hear his fate, plays out in a way that allows the family to feel that there is justice at the end of the day. So many different times we've seen officers not be tried, or officers found not guilty, or even the ones that have been found guilty given very light sentences. So it does seem like we're in a new era where Derek Chauvin may face the backlash of the movement that has called for accountability for police, and for police to be held to a higher standard than they may have faced in the past.
Tolu, how is Floyd's family coping with all of this media attention as they deal with their intense personal grief?
Yeah, one thing about this family is that it's a very large family, and it's a very diverse family. There are different kinds of people within the family. There are some that have gravitated more and been more comfortable, or been made to feel more comfortable in the media spotlight, and have taken on the role of activists, even though this is not how they saw themselves going into 2020 and 2021. But because of what happened, a few of Floyd's family members have been very much outspoken. They've started foundations, they've become activists, they've led some of these movements. Others have been much more quiet and been behind the scenes and have not wanted to spend as much time with the media. And I've had the privilege of speaking to people from various different parts of the family. And it's a family that it's still trying to grieve. A number of people around Floyd have said they've never had the opportunity to grieve, because as soon as this happened, they were thrust into what essentially was a social movement of millions of people co-opting their brother's name and using his death to push forward all kinds of different causes. And the family is definitely appreciative of the amount of love that's been shown for their relative. But at the same time, on a personal basis, they haven't had as much time to grieve, because they've been dealing with what has been a media firestorm and a national social movement that they have been kind of thrust into the middle of. So I think that after the sentencing, they will have somewhat of an opportunity to exhale and take a breath and say at least the criminal side of this is over. Chauvin has not only been convicted, but has been given a sentence, will be spending some potentially considerable amount of time in jail. And at least for that side of things, there will be some sense of closure. But the movement continues, and the family continues to push for the Justice and Policing Act and other reforms that they think need to take place, not only at the local level, but also nationally, to honor Floyd's legacy and to make sure that what happened to him does not happen to more people going forward.
So Tolu, since you're at the courthouse, tell us about the mood there. What is it like, and what's the sense of anticipation?
Well, it's definitely different than it was during the trial. There's not as much, fencing and sort of militaristic barricades up, but there's still, a lot of media attention to this case. There's still not as many, individuals and protesters here, especially now that Chauvin has been convicted. There's still a sense of anticipation within the community about what might happen. I've talked to some activists here who, are still skeptical that Chauvin will get the kind of sentence that he might have gotten if he were not a police officer. And some people are worried that he may get a light sentence as a result of the fact that he had a badge. But the community is still sort of waiting. It's not as intense, and the tension is not as high as it was during the trial, and especially not as high as it was in the aftermath of Floyd's death. But people are still watching and waiting, and the media attention is very high to try to find out what exactly is going to happen and whether or not Chauvin will be given the kind of sentence that others convicted of similar crimes, essentially murder in various degrees, would have gotten under similar circumstances. So there's a lot of anticipation, a lot of tension within the community, but less so than when there was concern about whether or not he would be convicted at all. Now that he has been convicted, I think there are fewer people out in the streets, fewer people potentially thinking about going out into the streets based on the sentence. But we'll just have to wait and see how the community responds. But it does seem like the level of tension, the level of concern among police officers and government officials that had barricaded the courthouse during the trial, that tension has been reduced significantly, and now it's just sort of a wait and see mode to see what exactly the judge is going to say.
All right, Tolu Olorunipa reporting live from the courthouse, which we're all watching. Thank you for joining us. We do anticipate Judge Cahill starting this sentencing hearing in about 8 minutes' time. So stay with us and stay with the Washington Post. We will be with you if there are any breaks during that sentencing, and then we'll be with you on the back end with my panel of guests to talk about what we learned today, what the sentence will be for Derek Chauvin in the murder of George Floyd. Mary Beth, let's go to you to remind us what's at stake here today as the sentencing hearing gets underway.
Well, Libby, whenever you watch any court proceeding, it's great to remember that a courtroom is just a room full of people. And all those people have their own backgrounds, and all those people have very specific roles in that courtroom. When you look at Judge Cahill, remember that his job is to give a sentence, a fair and lawful sentence. He's deciding on what the law is. The jury already decided what the facts of the case are. Now he's deciding what the law is. When you see the state, remember that their job is to look for justice. That's the job of the US government. That's the job of the state, right? Is to make sure that justice is done. When you look at Derek Chauvin's lawyer, Eric Nelson, remember this. He has one job. As a defense attorney, your job is to mitigate the consequences of your client, your convicted client's actions. That's his whole job, is to get Derek Chauvin the least amount of consequences for his murder of George Floyd. He does it he's an officer of the court, so he has to follow the law while he's doing it. But That's his job. That's his only job. And that's why he's asking for probation for Derek Chauvin. And because of his, he said, because of his lack of criminal record, also because Derek Chauvin's age. I think he's in his mid 40s. And so if he gets 30 years in prison, that is almost, if not definitely, a life sentence. He might talk about Derek Chauvin being particularly at risk in prison as former law enforcement. It's basically his job to pull anything out of the hat and to give it to the judge. While he's doing this, remember that he just filed a 66-page brief about what a bad job Judge Cahill did in running this entire trial. And so that's sort of an interesting place to be as a defense attorney when you're saying, hey, judge, you did a bad job of running the trial, but hey, just give him probation. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic. And then, of course, the family member's job is to remind us that there was an actual person behind this murder, that George Floyd had a life that was full and had a lot of people in it, and that they miss him. And so everyone has a really specific role. Watch for that, and watch for whether you believe that they fulfilled their role today.
And Mary Beth, you'll be joining us afterwards so we can sort of assess and decode exactly what we see. James, Mary Beth makes so many good points there, but one of them is this sort of tension innately in the system of Derek Chauvin's lawyer both saying, this should be declared a mistrial, this should totally be thrown out, which the judge has now denied already preemptively going into this, denied that. But also, as she points out, asking the judge for leniency, trying to win over the judge. It is a classic tension that comes up in court cases like this.
Yeah, in criminal cases, it would be malpractice for Eric Nelson, Officer Chauvin's attorney, not to go through these motions for someone who's been convicted, to lay the groundwork for appeal, which he did throughout the trial, and I expect that's what they're going to try to do. I think that there is, when you talk to a lot of lawyers, there's some dispute about whether he made a mistake by asking for probation, because that was just not in the cards at all. It's clearly not going to happen, especially once Judge Cahill said that there were going to be aggravating factors. So maybe he could have picked a more realistic number and then made a strong case for that. My prediction is that Cahill is going to end up sentencing somewhere between 18 to 22 years, but you really could be anywhere over the map. But when you look at Cahill's past sentencing guidelines, or past sentencing compared to the guidelines, as Mary Beth was showing us her chart, he often kind of takes a middle road, middle ground. Sometimes he veers upward in departing from what the guidelines are. And he is a former prosecutor, but he also is someone who's going to appreciate the things that Mary Beth just laid out, which is that he has no prior criminal history, all of that. So that's the tension is, did Eric Nelson serve his client by saying, just give him probation or time served, as opposed to making a real argument in this courtroom, not thinking about appeal, for getting his client the most lenient sentence possible that is also realistic.
And Rhonda, one of the big questions today, as we've been talking about, is whether or not Derek Chauvin will choose to speak today, to do anything from try to justify his actions or show remorse. But it is a big question mark as to whether or not he will choose to speak.
It is a big question mark. And if you remember back during the trial phase, he spoke, but it was very surprising because no one expected it. No one was given a heads up. And it was very brief. He expressed that he knew that he had the right to testify, but decided to not do it. But it was kind of jarring because we've never really heard from him. In fact, I'm sure many people in that room, it was the first time they've ever heard his voice. So right now, from the defense's standpoint, it kind of looks like he's in a rock and a hard place if he does or doesn't say anything. Of course, as we've noted, he could get some leniency if he did say he was remorseful or made any sort of efforts to say that he's remorseful or explain why he did what he did. But the defense, if you remember, they stuck to the refrain of he was within his duties when he had his knee on the neck of George Floyd, that it was consistent with his training, that he didn't do anything wrong. And because there is this federal case hanging overhead, it would really not to be to their advantage for him to say anything against that defense that they've already laid out. And also with the federal case, it's important to point out that he's also under an additional federal indictment outside of what the other officers are facing because of a case that happened before George Floyd. He also pinned down a young teenage boy back in 2017, and that case was not brought up in the trial. That is a part of these federal charges. So again, hearing from him, they're definitely going to have to create some sort of balancing act if he is indeed going to speak because of that federal case hanging overhead.
And we do anticipate, as we've talked about, hearing George Floyd family members speak because they will address the judge. They won't address Derek Chauvin, but they'll address the judge and continue to paint the portrait of the man that they lost. That all gets factoring in to sentencing as Judge Peter Cahill decides Derek Chauvin's fate. We do expect to go to the Hennepin County Courthouse any moment now, so stay with the Washington Post throughout the afternoon, and we'll bring this to you as it gets underway. James, there is the tension of those federal charges hanging overhead, and so everyone will be watching very closely how this goes today and what exactly is said, not only for the sentence that is delivered today, but because it does set the stage for the next steps of the process.
Absolutely, Libby. Everyone is watching. The three other officers are watching closely to see what the sentence is because that will impact them in all likelihood as well. And the city of Minneapolis is watching. We don't see the same kinds of barricades in the National Guard like we did during the trial. But I was talking with someone this afternoon who was planning to go to the Minnesota Twins game today and decided not to, just because there's some fear that there could be violence if there is a feeling that this sentence isn't harsh enough.
Mary Beth Albright, anything else that you want us to pay close attention to? We're going to pause that there and go to the courtroom. I see Judge Cahill preparing to speak. Let's go now to the Hennepin County
before the court, the
Courthouse.
state of Minnesota versus Derek Michael Chauvin. District Court file number is 27 CR 20-12646. Matters on for sentencing. Counsel, note your appearances beginning with the state.
Good afternoon, Matthew Frank, Assistant Attorney General on behalf of the state.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Jerry Blackwell from the state of Minnesota.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Steve Swisher on behalf of the state of Minnesota. Your Honor, Keith Ellison, Attorney General on behalf of the state of Minnesota.
And for the defense.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Eric Nelson and Amy Voss appearing on behalf of Mr. Chauvin.
Thank you. We are still, for all those attending, under somewhat modified COVID restrictions. So we are asking that everyone keep their masks on unless they are speaking. I'll ask for people who are speaking to come up to the lectern and use the microphones, and please to remove your mask so that we can hear you clearly, and also to maintain the distances that we have set out in the courtroom. With that, we'll proceed first with the state. Mr. Blackwell, you may proceed with victim input.
Your Honor, we have 4 victim impact statements. We will start with the 7-year-old daughter of George Floyd, Gianna Floyd, who will present hers by video.
What do you miss most about your daddy?
Well, I ask about him all the time. And that's kind of it.
Yeah. Well, when you ask about him, what are you asking about?
Well, I was asking, how did my dad get hurt?
Do you wish that he was still here with us?
Yeah, but he is.
Through his spirit?
Yes.
Yes. And when you see your daddy again one day, what do you want to do when you see him?
I want to play with him.
What kind of games do you want to play with him?
I want to play with him, have fun, go on a plane ride, and that's it.
Yeah. Would you?
We used to have dinner meals every single night before we went to bed. My daddy always used to help me brush my teeth.
Oh. Do you miss him helping brush your teeth?
Yes.
How do you hope that the world remembers him?
Well, they helped him because those mean people did something to him.
Yeah. If you could say anything to your daddy right now, what would it be?
It would be, I miss you and I love you.
All right. Thank you, Gianna. I really appreciate you answering questions today.
That was Gianna Floyd. Your Honor, next we'll hear from the nephew of George Floyd, Brandon Williams. Mr. Williams.
If you could begin by giving us your full name and spelling each of your names.
Brandon Williams, Brandon Williams.
Thank you. You may proceed.
On Monday, May 25th, 2020, George Perry Floyd Jr. was murdered by Derek Chauvin in a malicious and insidious display of hate and abuse of power. Chauvin killed George. Not only did he kill George, but he also displayed a total lack of consideration for human life as he did so. You saw it, I saw it, and millions of people across this country and the globe witnessed the act of hate. A year and 1 month later, I stand there before you tasked with the duty of expressing how George's death has impacted me personally and the rest of our family. As I racked my brain and thought about what I could say today, I came to this conclusion. It is humanly impossible for me to stand here and convey or articulate the right words that would capture all that we are feeling and what we have felt over this period. So please bear with me as I attempt the impossible. The sudden murder of George has forever traumatized us. You may see us cry, but the full extent of our pain and trauma will never be seen with the naked eye. The heartbreak and hurt goes far beyond any number of tears we could ever cry. Words simply cannot express the pain, anguish, and suffering that our family and friends have endured since George's murder. It has been truly unimaginable, but not as nearly unimaginable as the defendant's decision to take the life of a human being with no regard for the effect it may have on others. Although Chauvin will be sentenced today and spend time in prison, he will have the luxury of seeing his family again, talking to them, and he will likely get to spend time with them upon his release. These are all luxuries that my young cousin Gianna were robbed of when Chauvin made the active decision to kill our father. There will be no more birthday parties, no graduations, holiday gatherings, or other family celebrations. The laughter, hugs, guidance, advice, sense of security, and those opportunities to simply say I love you are forever gone. They say time heals all, and while I generally believe that saying, it's challenging to do so given these unfathomable set of circumstances. Before I conclude, I must highlight a few things. George's murder, this trial, and everything in between has been tragic and devastating. Our family is forever broken, and one thing we cannot get back is George Floyd. It is the request of my family that the maximum penalty for the crime for which the defendant was convicted be imposed. On behalf of my family, friends, community, and supporters, I wish to express my sincerest gratitude for allowing us opportunities of expression. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Your Honor, just for the record, this wonderful lady standing here is a Hennepin County victim advocate.
Ms. Boswell is well known to the court.
Yes, thank you, Judge.
And so, Your Honor, we'll next hear from the brother of George Floyd, Mr. Terrence Floyd.
And Mr. Floyd, if you could state your full name, spelling each of your names.
Yes. Terrence Floyd. That's Terrence, Floyd, Floyd.
Go ahead.
I'm here representing my brother. I'm from New York. On May 25th, 2020, my brother was murdered, everyone knows, by Derek Chauvin. The facts of this case were proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and 3 guilty verdicts have been rendered. This situation has really affected me and my family. Any family member that has went through this, we are part of a fraternity of families, and it's not one of those, fraternities that you enjoy. I just, over this last year and months, I actually talked to a few people, and I wanted to know from the man himself, why? What were you thinking? What was going through your head when you had your knee on my brother's neck? Why when you knew that he posed no threat anymore, he was handcuffed, why you didn't at least get up? Why you stayed there?
You take your time.
A month before my brother was murdered, I was on the phone with him, and we had a long conversation. And as I looked at the video of my niece, the last conversation me and my brother had was he wanted to have play dates. He wanted to plan play dates with Gianna and my daughter. And we started setting it up. That can't happen. And I have to, my daughter's still young, but I still have to explain to her, because this is history. This is a case everybody knows about. So she's gonna find out, and I'm gonna have to explain that to her. And I think that's, to me, harder than even just standing here, that I have to talk to my daughter and tell her, about her niece, about her uncle, about the situation. That's basically reliving it all over again, years down the line. I'm here on behalf of my family, on behalf of me and my family, we seek the maximum penalty. We don't want to see no more slaps on the wrists. We've been through that already. In my community, in my culture, we've been through that already. Smacked on the wrist. No. Because if it was us, if the roles was reversed, there wouldn't be no case. It would have been open and shut. We'd have been under the jail for murdering somebody. So we asked for that same penalty for Derek Chauvin. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Your Honor, the final victim impact statement for the state will come from George Floyd's brother, Phalonis Floyd.
Sir, if you could begin by giving us your full name and spell each of your names, and I have permitted you to use your phone because you have notes on it. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And you may proceed when you're ready. Giving us your full name first.
Philonise Floyd, spelled Philonise. Last name Floyd, Floyd.
And you may proceed.
One year ago, May 25th, my brother George was murdered by Derek Chauvin and his co-defendants in broad daylight with a knee to his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. I was a trucker, and immediately my life changed forever. I began to speak to the world for George from the United Nations, Africa, Canada, Japan, and so many other countries. Every day, I have begged for justice to be served, reliving the execution of George, while others begged and pleaded for Officer Chauvin to simply just allow George to take a breath. I haven't had a real night's sleep because of the nightmares I constantly have hearing my brother beg and plead for his life over and over again. Even saying, they're going to kill me. Please, officer. Screaming for our mom. I have had to sit through each day of Officer Derek Chauvin's trial and watch the video of George dying for hours over and over again. For an entire year, I had to relive George being tortured to death every hour of the day, only taking naps and not knowing what a good night's sleep is anymore. I've been lifting my voice tirelessly every day so that George's death will not be in vain. Honorable Judge Peter Cahill, I thank you for allowing me to share this today. George's life mattered. So my family and I, most of all, my niece, Gianna. My niece, Gianna, she needs closure. I'm asking that you please find it suitable to give Officer Chauvin the maximum sentence possible, charge that he has been found guilty for. My family and I have been given a life sentence. We will never be able to get George back. Daddy's our daughter's first love. He would never be able to walk Gianna down the aisle at her wedding, attend those magical moments of her life like a daddy-daughter dance, sweet 16 party, seeing her out for prom graduations, and she would never be able to have any personal memories with her father. With a smirk on his face and children present, Officer Chauvin used excessive force and acted against his training. Chauvin had no regards for human life, George's life. I stand before you today asking you to please help us find closure by giving Chauvin the maximum sentence possible, making sure he does his time consecutively without the possibilities of parole, probation, or getting out early for good behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Your Honor. Here today, of course, for sentencing, gives us an opportunity to speak about other matters that I think are involved in sentencing and where we are in the criminal justice system in the processing of this case. As a member of an elected office representing the people of the state of Minnesota, as well as people of the local community, I want to say a couple of things. And first of all, I want to really thank some of the police officers at the Minneapolis Police Department. who, under great pressure, great stress, to some extent at peril to their occupations, what they've devoted their life to, stuck to their oath and their commitment as police officers to speak openly and honestly about policing and the training that is given and received by police officers. Those officers didn't hide behind a blue wall. They came forward, they told this court and those jurors what they knew about training and responsibility. And I think they deserve recognition and credit for that. Would also like to thank members of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. You know, those agents get called in, great sacrifice to their personal lives. Whenever things happen, they go. They did that here, and under really extraordinary circumstances, completed a very professional and thorough investigation. You know, conducting interviews is hard enough, but conducting them in the atmosphere of the city following the murder of George Floyd was even more difficult. And they did so, I think, above and beyond the call of duty. And I want to thank them for doing that on behalf of the whole prosecution staff. Your Honor, I want to thank the family, the loved ones, the friends of George Floyd. They have been through so much more than families involved in murder cases. He's right. It's a fraternity you don't want to be part of. But they've been through so much more because of the pandemic and because of security, safety precautions that we've had to take. They have been through a lot. At a time when they try to grieve, like everybody does for the loss of someone, they are going through so much more. And I want to thank them, all of them, the family. The court saw testimony from Philonise Floyd, Courtney Ross. These are people who are trying to deal with their loss, but they have to do it in a very public way and under very trying circumstances through no fault of their own. So I thank them. They have all been models of grace and understanding. And it's really remarkable, quite frankly. I'll, I think, come back to them again in a little bit. Your Honor, we have submitted a sentencing brief. I would incorporate that. I guess I would incorporate my comments today into that memo. But I do think there are things that I want to bring out today in my arguments. For hundreds of years, the court had discretion in sentencing. It was the trial court's decision on what a sentence should be. The recognition that the trial court sat through the trial, watched the evidence, and saw how it affected people, informed the court's discretion. When the legislature passed the guidelines, in a legitimate attempt to try and even out sentences, they defined certain presumptive sentences, as we all know, for typical crimes. For each crime, the typical crime. But they did not remove discretion for sentencing judges. They recognized that nobody is better suited to decide whether this is the typical case represented by that guideline's presumptive sentence, or if there are reasons why this is worse than that. And the guideline still gives this court discretion when there are aggravating factors to give a more serious sentence than what the guidelines presumption calls for. And as you know, we are asking you to do that today. As this court found, there are 4 aggravating factors that we have identified. They go beyond a list of just what those factors are. We have not just done our homework and found a list. The court made good findings, detailed findings about those factors. And we think they justify a greatly increased sentence. This is not the typical second-degree unintentional murder. Supreme Court in our state has said that, very recently, even one aggravating factor is sufficient to go twice the top of the range. Here we have 4. The first one that the court found is an abusive position of trust and authority. And the court specifically found that when Mr. Chauvin was acting as a police officer, he had a position of trust and authority. That is certainly true. We trust police officers. We trust them when we need help. We call them for help. We trust that they're going to take care of the problems that they are assigned to deal with, right? We trust them. We also give them great authority. We give them great power. We give them power to use force that individuals would be prosecuted for using, right? We give them authority to arrest, to detain. And with great power, of course, comes great responsibility. So they're not sent out there by themselves to do this. They're given substantial training. This court saw all of that through the trial in general and in specific to Mr. Chauvin and the other 3 officers. They're given training on the use of force, the proportional use of force. The force used has to be warranted by the threat. They're given training on de-escalation because we recognize that police officers are called in when people are not having their best day, when people might be affected by mental illness, drug abuse, any number of issues. They're just having a bad day, and they're trained for that and should be. And they're taught how to use that to de-escalate and control a situation. They're taught medical intervention. They're taught to provide medical attention to people who need it. Being a police officer is a difficult job. We ask a lot of them. It's a profession, there's no doubt about it. But we give them a substantial amount of training, and most officers do it right. This case wasn't about police officers, all police officers. It wasn't about policing. This case was about Derek Chauvin disregarding all that training he received and assaulting Mr. Floyd until he suffocated to death. One of the things that you heard, Your Honor, and the jurors heard that can really encapsulate, I think, a very important issue here. 7 words: in your custody is in your care. And it's a real simple mantra. It's a real easy thing to remember. You're going to take custody of somebody, you have to provide care. You have to do it in a caring way. You can't simply disregard their care. Mr. Chauvin abused his position of trust and authority as a police officer by doing just that, just disregarding all his training. It was an abuse of that because what did he decide to do? We often are forced in this, criminal justice system to infer people's state of mind by their conduct and their statements. What was Derek Chauvin's end game here? What was the plan? Seems apparent the plan was hold him down until we can dump him in an ambulance and no longer have him be our problem. You recall he said to Charles McMillan, "He's a big guy, might be on something." That's it. He held Mr. Floyd down as Mr. Floyd begged for his life. He had the other officers help in that regard. And rather than doing the simple expedient of putting him on his side, he said, yeah, He was dismissive to that duty of care. We trust that arrestees will be treated with respect, reasonable force, and that their medical needs will be addressed. I'm paraphrasing from the court's findings. That trust was violated. We trust that they will use their authority reasonably. And this was a particularly egregious abuse of that force. Again, paraphrasing the court's findings. The typical second-degree murder does not involve that extent of abuse of a dearly held position of abuse or a position of authority and trust by the community, by individuals of the community. Your Honor found that Mr. Floyd was treated by Mr. Chauvin with particular cruelty. I think tortured is the right word. We know that, I mean, we've all seen it. Mr. Floyd did not want to be in the back seat. That's it. I mean, that's the rub. It was the need to get him in that back seat no matter what. And we all saw that once he was pulled out of that back seat, he calmed right down, even willingly went down to the ground. I'm going down, he said. And he went down to the ground, not fighting, not punching. And he was placed initially on his side. He's already handcuffed. He's placed on his side in the recovery position, like he should be, because he's trying to breathe. And then quickly placed prone on the ground, face down. Mr. Chauvin put his left knee on George Floyd's neck, his right knee on George Floyd's back, face down on the pavement. Had Officer King sit on Mr. Floyd's waist area and had Officer Lane hold his feet down. You can even see Mr. Floyd trying to pull his feet up. We all are going to fight to breathe. Everybody knows that fear when you all of a sudden realize you're having trouble breathing. It's just innate, right? We want to survive. We know we have to breathe. And there's an automatic reaction when you begin to feel like that is threatened. And you can see Mr. Floyd going through that. He tries to pull his feet up. But he's held down by these three officers while Officer Tao is looking on. Later, of course, goes to keep the people who want to help away. He's placed face down on this pavement so harshly that it rubs the skin off his face. He has injuries to his face from being face down on that pavement. He has injuries to his knuckles from just trying to lift himself up. And he's telling Officer Chauvin, I can't breathe. I'm dying. And Mr. Chauvin's response was, uh-huh. And all this time, I mean, imagine what Mr. Floyd is going through. If you're going to talk about particular cruelty and torture, really try to appreciate what he's going through. He knows he's suffocating. We all know that feeling of not being able to breathe enough. And he's begging, he's pleading, and he's being ignored. His concerns are being dismissed by somebody who has taken custody but not care. He was kept in that prone position for 9.5 minutes and was suffocated. There's no other way to say it. That's particularly cruel. That is more cruel than the typical second-degree unintentional murder. Significantly more. This is not a momentary gunshot, punch to the face. This is 9.5 minutes of cruelty to a man who was helpless and just begging for his life. This court found that there were children present, standing only a few feet from these officers. These children, who were ages 17 and one child age 9. Why is that an aggravating factor? Well, I think everybody can figure that out. Right? It's particularly bad to commit a crime in front of children. We've heard a lot of academia about the development of the young brain and how long it can take. And here you got a couple of teenage girls, a 9-year-old girl. How are they going to process this? Standing feet from a man being suffocated by police officers. Such a stark sight that one of the children even says, we got to call the police on the police. How do you process that as a 9-year-old? The children were not only present watching a man die. We've all seen, if you haven't, you really need to look at George Floyd's face as he's dying, he's suffering. The children have to watch this. But not only that, police officers, and there are people around them wanting to help. And at one point, and sure, they got upset. At one point, Mr. Chauvin points his mace, grabs his mace to keep him back. How does a child look at that? There's another officer screaming at them to get back. The typical second-degree unintentional murder doesn't involve children standing feet away, watching a 9.5-minute suffocation of a man begging for his life. This court also made a finding that the defendant committed the offense with the involvement of 3 or more other persons. Lane and King were involved directly in the restraint, and that Tao kept the bystanders at bay. I've already talked a little bit about Lane and King's role in holding Mr. Floyd down. They recognized that he was pulseless, that Mr. Floyd was pulseless at one point, and yet really made no effort to take care of the person in their custody. Officer Tao watched most of the suffocation and then only went over to keep people from giving help. One person who is identified as a medical trained firefighter for the city of Minneapolis, and that was dismissed. Like, are we going to believe her? So they kept trained medical people from providing help. These were all uniformed peace officers, adding to that abuse of trust and authority. Your Honor, I know the defense has asked the court for probation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time arguing that. It's so outside of the realm of, I think, real possibility. This is a murder. I understand some of the arguments made on behalf of Mr. Chauvin. I understand, well, no, I can't understand what his family members and friends are going through. I can't. But it's certainly not enough for a departure to probation for a second-degree murder. We believe, Your Honor, that these 4 aggravating factors and the findings that the court has made certainly justify an upward departure because there are 4 of them, not standing alone, but in a sense, not overlapping, but coming together to show this is not the typical second-degree murder. This is egregious. And this justifies a double upward departure. From the top of the box, which is 180 months, we're asking the court to do a double departure, recognizing all 4 factors, to 360 months. As I mentioned before, Your Honor, this is sentencing. This is the time for victims, right? This is the time for the loved ones of the victim and the community to have a say. Again, I commend this family. I commend all of the loved ones, the friends, the people that have been involved in this case for tolerating and being gracious. None of this, of course, can bring George Floyd back. That's very true. But this is the time for our criminal justice system to say, we hear you. This is the time for their criminal justice system to say, we recognize that this harm you're going through is real. And while we can't feel what you're feeling, we know we can do what your criminal justice system should do and recognize the severity of this crime and reflect that in the sentence to be given. It's time for this criminal justice system to say, we recognize this is more serious than the typical second-degree unintentional murder. The 4 reasons the court found reflect that and give this court more than an adequate basis to do that. Your Honor, we ask the court to impose a sentence of 360 months, commitment to the Commissioner of Corrections. As you know, Your Honor, there are no fines in murder cases. And we would ask the court just to reserve the issue of restitution. We can clarify that with the family and present that to the court for 30 days. Thank you, Your Honor.
Anything further from the state?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Mr. Nelson. I'm sorry. Mr. Blackwell?
Sorry, I just thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, at this time, the defendant's mother, Carolyn Palenti, would like to address the court.
If you could state your full name, spelling each of your names, and proceed when you're ready.
Carolyn, Carolyn, Palenti, Pawlenty. I am the mother of Derek Chauvin. I am here to speak on behalf of my entire family. On November 25th, 2020, not only did Derek's life change forever, but so did mine and my family's. Derek devoted 19 years of his life to the Minneapolis Police Department. It has been difficult for me to hear and read what the media, public, and prosecution team believe Derek to be an aggressive, heartless, and uncaring person. I can tell you that is far from the truth. My son's identity has also been reduced to that as a racist. I want this court to know that none of these things are true and that my son is a good man. Derek always dedicated his life and time to the police department. Even on his days off, he would call in to see if they needed help. Derek is a quiet, thoughtful, honorable, and selfless man. He has a big heart, and he always has put others before his own. The public will never know the loving and caring man he is, but his family does. Even though I have not spoken publicly, I have always supported him 100% and always will. Derek has played over and over in his head the events of that day. I've seen the toll it has taken on him. I believe a lengthy sentence will not serve Derek well. When you sentence my son, you will also be sentencing me. I will not be able to see Derek, talk to him on the phone, or give him our special hug. Plus the fact that when he is released, his father and I most likely will not be here. Derek, my happiest moment is when I gave birth to you. And my second is when I was honored to pin your police badge on you. I remember you whispering to me, "Don't stick me with it." Derek, I want you to know I have always believed in your innocence, and I will never waver from that. I have read numerous letters from people around the world that also believe in your innocence. No matter where you go, where you are, I will always be there to visit you. I promise you I will stay strong, as we talked about, and I want you to do the same for me. I will do what you told me to do, take care of myself, so I will be here for you when you come home. Remember, there is no stronger bond or love than a mother's love. One final thought I want you to remember. Remember, you are my favorite son. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Nelson.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. It is my intent that my remarks this afternoon be quite brief. I do not intend to relitigate the facts of this case, nor spend any substantial time looking at the law. The court is very familiar with the facts of this case, and the parties have fully briefed the court relevant to the sentencing factors. And we recognize that in any case, any sentencing that comes before the court is tasked with a difficult job. The court must craft a sentence that serves the interests of justice, a rather nebulous term. The court must take into consideration the victim impact, public interest, as well as the circumstances and the history of the defendant. And in this case, more than any other, that likely any of us have ever been involved in, that task is exceedingly more difficult. In my remarks today, I just wish to briefly address each of those three considerations, starting with the public impact. As I believe we are all cognizant of, this case is at the epicenter of a cultural and political divide. We tried to keep a lot of that out of the courtroom during the trial and make this case about the facts. But we recognize what has happened as a result of this case. There are a great number of people who will view any sentence you pronounce as overly lenient and insufficient to satisfy justice. But there are an equal number of people who will view any sentence you pronounce as draconian or overbearing. Either way, some percentage of the public will view your sentence as a miscarriage of justice. The intensity of the public interest in this case cannot be understated. I trust that the volume of correspondence that each of us has received from the public at large is indicative of these very sentiments on both sides. As I was informed just yesterday, the Attorney General's office established a website, web submission to accept community impact statements. Again, in my understanding is in a little over 2 weeks, they received over 1,000 submissions. Again, on both sides. By my very best estimate, since my representation of Mr. Chauvin began last summer, I would estimate that I have received over 5,000 emails, over 1,000 voicemails, and hundreds of handwritten letters. Again, from both sides. And I expect that Your Honor has likewise been inundated with public comment and scrutiny. The impact that this case has had on this community is profound. It goes far beyond what happened on May 25th of last year. It has been at the forefront of our national consciousness, and it has weaved its way into nearly every facet of our lives, from the entertainment that we consume to the presidential politics, from protests to conspiracy theories. In the end, it is my sincere hope that when this proverbial dust settles, the community impact brings forth principled debate and civil public discourse, and ultimately leaves a positive effect on the city of Minneapolis, the state of Minnesota, and the United States. But nevertheless, while this court may consider the community impact, it is for these very same reasons that the court must turn to the foundational legal principles and remember that justice is blind. Law is built on reason and common sense, and it cannot be permitted to be assailed by public opinion. Turning to the second consideration, which is the victim impact, the death of George Floyd. The death of George Floyd was tragic. He is loved by his family members. He is loved by his friends. And his death is justifiably mourned by those whose lives he impacted. He is a son, a brother, a father, an uncle, and a friend to many. And as the court heard today, the impact and the loss of his life, simply just, it can't be simplified. And it will take time. Finally, Your Honor, the court must take into consideration, just like it has to take into consideration the aggravating factors, it needs to take into consideration the mitigating factors. And the mitigating factors as set forth by the sentencing guidelines really point to the TROG analysis, essentially, ultimately in this case. We're not going to spend a lot of time, again, arguing for a probationary sentence. That's briefed. But that being said, when we look at the TROG factors, who is Derek Chauvin? Derek Chauvin spent 19 years as a Minneapolis police officer. He loved being a police officer. I was contacted during the course of my representation and have had numerous conversations with his fellow police officers or fellow police officers that worked with Derek, some retired, some still active. And they told me that he was a solid police officer, that he did his job, that if somebody asked him to do a particular task, he never complained, he did it. One person told me that one of his sergeants told me that if I had asked him to dig a ditch for 8 hours, he would have picked up a shovel and he would have never complained for a second. He would have done his job. He was decorated as a police officer, multiple life-saving awards. He was decorated for valor. He was proud to be a police officer because what he liked to do was help people. And as the statistics show, the vast majority of police work is helping people. He was proud to be a Minneapolis police officer. He served his country as the United States in the United States Army. And he too is a son, and a brother, and a father, and a friend. He too, his life, the life he's lived, he's not coming into this as a career criminal with 6 points, 5 points, 4 points. He's coming into this never having violated the law because he lived an honorable life and he attempted to live an honorable life. Derek Chauvin was not even scheduled to work on May 25th, 2020. He volunteered because there was short staffing at the time. I know from numerous conversations that I've had with Derek that his brain is littered with what ifs. What if I just had not agreed to go in that day? What if things had gone differently? What if I never responded to that call? What if? The truth of the matter is, and the end result is that we are here after a jury verdict, finding him guilty of these offenses. And the courts consideration should not only be focused on the aggravating factors, but the mitigating factors as well. The Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission was established for a reason. And yes, the court in circumstances like these has discretion to go beyond and aggravate a sentence beyond the presumptive sentences established by the sentencing guidelines. But the sentencing guidelines don't differentiate between second-degree murders. Someone robs a liquor store, a police officer is involved in an incident, and a person dies in police custody. The law presumes, the legislature presumes that the sentencing guidelines as established is a sufficient penalty for all of the second-degree murder categories or cases you would see. From 2019 back to 2010, a total of 90 people were sentenced for second-degree murder. Those sentences, those people, there were more than that, but people who had a 0 criminal history score, more than 90 people were sentenced. 67%, or 60 of those 90 people, received a guideline sentence of 150 months. So 2/3 of all people in this same position received a guideline sentence. 20% received an aggravated sentence, 18 of the 90, and 13% or 12 individuals were granted mitigated departures. So if the legislature and the intent of the sentencing guidelines is to eliminate sentencing disparity, the law should presume that the guideline sentence is what is appropriate in this case. Judge may take into consideration at this point those aggravating factors, but you have to counterbalance them, which is the goal of the law, with the mitigating factors. I know that this has been an incredibly difficult case for the Floyd family to have to endure. The state of Minnesota, likewise, prosecutors in this case have endured quite a bit, as has Mr. Chauvin's family. This is a case that has changed the world to some degree, and I hope it's positive. But it's my hope that the court follows the sentencing guidelines, applies the law in a reasoned manner, and imposes a just sentence.
Actually, Mr. Chauvin, would you join Mr. Nelson at the lectern? Mr. Chauvin, this is your opportunity if you wish to give any input to the court. And so I turn it over to you and your attorney.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, due to some additional legal matters at hand, I'm not able to give a full formal statement at this time. But very briefly, though, I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family. There's going to be some other information in the future that would be of interest. And I hope things will give you some peace of mind. Thank you.
And I'll note that I did read your comments in the pre-sentence investigation as well.
Thanks, Fred.
All right, we are going to take a 15-minute recess so that I can complete the sentencing order based on what I've heard today. And let's reconvene at 2:45. We're in recess.
The court is now in a brief break. You are watching the sentencing of Derek Chauvin with the newsroom of the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. We finally just heard from Derek Chauvin, his opportunity to speak. We didn't hear a lot, though. Let's go to my guests, Rhonda Colvin, Mary Beth Albright, James Homan. Rhonda, we were all watching to see if Derek Chauvin would express remorse, would somehow try to justify his actions. What we saw was this very brief appearance where he sort of seemed to indicate that there would be some more information forthcoming. What did you make of his brief appearance there?
It seems as if the defense has found a balance to strike there with having him say a few words. He did express condolences to the Floyd family, but he did not, in any sense, take responsibility or apologize for his actions. And he said he couldn't comment any further because of pending another case, which is the federal case that he's also in front of. So just a few brief lines from him. He said that there would be more information to come that might be of interest to them. So it does sound like the defense found a way for him to speak and be a part of this hearing. But again, they did not have him say sorry or offer anything further.
Rhonda, give us your impressions so far of what we've heard. We have this 15-minute break. We do expect Judge Cahill to come back. And then at that point, we're watching to see what he decides for the sentencing. But talk us through what we've seen so far in this past hour.
I think we're all just thrown back into the entire event, the killing of George Floyd, because we've heard from his family, we've seen their grief. One of his brothers appeared to have some trouble speaking. His brother from New York had trouble speaking and seemed to be getting emotional. Matthew Frank, one of the prosecutors, he also paused a few times in his statements, and it seemed as if he was getting emotional, saying the family has been through a lot. So what we've seen so far is that humanizing element that we saw during the trial of reminding us all that George Floyd was a person. He became a rallying cry. He is at the center of a lot of racial equality work that's been going around, happening around the nation. But he was a person. He was loved. And I thought it was particularly poignant that the prosecution started off with a video of his daughter, his young daughter. That was almost hard to watch in a sense when you know this little girl will not ever have her father, will not be growing up with him. But she talked about things that kids talk about. She misses that he's not there to help her brush her teeth. And that's certainly hard to hear. But that was likely a tactic from the prosecution to inject some a human angle to this, that we should all remember this man was killed in a way that it took a period of minutes. It wasn't a gunshot and a quick thing. It was over a period of time. We also heard from Derek Chauvin's mother, and that was important because if you were following the trial portion as well as jury selection, we didn't find out if there was anyone there to support Chauvin through all of that. We were told by pool reporters that the chair that the courtroom had set up for a Chauvin supporter was empty. In fact, they took it away at one point in the trial because nobody was coming for him. So to hear from his mother, she talked about the anguish she's gone through. She said her son isn't a racist, and it's hard for her to hear how the prosecution has painted him. And she, I don't recall, but I don't think she offered much condolence to the Floyd family, but she did talk about her grief. So that is important to remember, that there are so many people affected by this situation. But of course, George Floyd's family, hearing from them, I think we're all reliving that anguish and remembering these people are now going on without their brother and their loved one.
We'll talk more about Derek Chauvin's mother in a moment. But first, let's revisit some of that testimony that Rhonda was talking about when we heard those four family members of George Floyd testify in those, or speak rather, in those victim impact statements. Two brothers, one nephew, and his 7-year-old daughter. And George Floyd's brother, Terrence, made an emotional appeal, and he asked Judge Cahill to give Chauvin the maximum sentence. At one point, Terrence Floyd addressed the defendants who was watching.
I wanted to know from the man himself, why? What were you thinking? What was going through your head when you had your knee on my brother's neck? Why, when you knew that he posed no threat anymore, he was handcuffed, why you didn't at least get up? Why you stayed there?
Terrence Floyd giving a victim impact statement today. James Homan, you really heard, both in the way those family members spoke, but also in what they said, how this has been so traumatizing and they have so much loss. But you also got a sense of how murder as a cause of death is especially horrific for loved ones to grapple with, as opposed to a death from natural causes, and sort of how this has haunted them, how this specific death has haunted them for the past 13 months.
Absolutely, Libby. We heard about, the how they're not able to get a full night's sleep. The video conversation with his 7-year-old daughter was extraordinarily painful, because it seems like she hasn't fully grasped that her dad isn't coming back, that they're not going to be able to play together and go on an airplane together, and that is part of the healing process, going through the stages of grief. And that was one of the points that the prosecutor Frank made, which is that this kind of suffering, this coping, would be hard for any family after any relative died, but it was compounded by, one, the fact that it was a murder, two, that it happened during the pandemic, and three, that this trial generated such international attention, and that they were thrust immediately into this cultural flashpoint, into the presidential campaign, and that they all of a sudden saw their brother or their cousin or their dad used as a symbol for something bigger than him, when they were trying to cope with the idea that they had lost him. And they knew George Floyd not as an idea, but as a man. And I do think they came across with those 4 really pretty actually concise victim impact statements, coming kind of one after the other. The 4 put together really packed a punch.
James, let's talk about the flip side of this, the defense, and what we did hear from Derek Chauvin and what we also heard from his mother.
Yeah, and so Eric Nelson, I thought it was striking that he didn't lean into making the case for probation. Obviously, he knows that Judge Cahill's not going to give probation. So you heard him, it actually sounded much more practical than he had in his briefs. And it was important to hear from his mom, to highlight that he is, a son, and that this has been hard on him. I thought that there were some efforts there with her statement and with what Nelson said, where Nelson said, my client is always asking himself, I know from conversations, what if he hadn't signed up to work that extra shift that Memorial Day? What if he hadn't responded to that call? And similarly, you heard the mother, Mrs. Palenti, say, he has agonized over this. He's beating himself up over this. And the reason that you had them saying it instead of Derek Chauvin himself saying it is because Chauvin doesn't want to put himself in more legal jeopardy when these federal charges are pending. So they were trying to get across that there is this sense of remorse, but it is much less consequential coming from these outside players on the periphery than coming from the defendant himself.
James, let's listen to some of that emotional plea that Derek Chauvin's mother made, telling the judge that she hopes that he will consider the fact that she will probably not even be alive once he's out of jail if he's given the full sentence. And she also said that she still believes in his innocence. Let's watch.
My son's identity has also been reduced to that as a racist. I want this court to know that none of these things are true, and that my son is a good man. Derek always dedicated his life and time to the police department. Even on his days off, he would call in to see if they needed help. Derek is a quiet, thoughtful, honorable, and selfless man. He has a big heart, and he always has put others before his own. The public will never know the loving and caring man he is, but his family does. Even though I have not spoken publicly, I have always supported him 100% and always will. Derek has played over and over in his head the events of that day. I've seen the toll it has taken on him. I believe a lengthy sentence will not serve Derek well. When you sentence my son, you will also be sentencing me.
Derek Chauvin's mother giving a statement to Judge Cahill and to the court before the sentencing, which we know will happen shortly. We'll go back to the Hennepin County Courthouse as soon as Judge Cahill resumes this hearing today. James Homan, it is, judges have to grapple with this, right? They are used to hearing victim impact statements. They are used to hearing family members or even the person convicted plea for leniency. So this is something that he's used to hearing. She didn't talk about and focus on the Floyd family and their loss. That was not the focus of what she was there to do today, but it was noticeably lacking, James.
It wasn't just lacking. It was striking that you're absolutely right, Libby. But she said, I still maintain and believe and am certain that my son was innocent. Then she said that she's received hundreds of letters from people telling her that they also believe that Derek Chauvin is innocent. Eric Nelson said he has heard from current and former Minneapolis police officers defending Chauvin. What that illustrates is a lack of remorse. That they don't think that he's guilty, and that was farther than she needed to go, because ultimately it doesn't get to balancing, as you put it, the aggravating and the mitigating factors. And so I thought that kind of illustrated that they really don't think he's guilty. And something that is a relevant factor in sentencing is the remorse of the convicted murderer. And you could tell there at the end that Chauvin was trying to balance that by expressing condolences to the Floyd family without apologizing. But ultimately, we have not seen remorse for this 9.5 minutes of behavior that got him convicted and that caused an uproar across the world.
Let's go now to our colleague Joyce Coe, who's reporting from George Floyd Square in Minneapolis. So Joyce, what is the scene like outside Cup Foods as we await the sentencing?
You know, Libby, there are community members that are gathered sort of along the perimeter of this square, and I think everyone is just on pins and needles waiting to see what that sentencing will be like. I'm joined right now by Alexis Collins, who's an activist. Alexis, you've been out here on this square since day one, you said. What are you feeling today as sort of the conclusion of the legal process of this comes to a head?
I just feel like today it's been a long process just to get sentencing, and I feel like everybody that been here on George Floyd, we're not going for nothing than 30 or less. Like, we don't want 15, we don't want 20, we need 30 as a maximum, because at the end of the day, it took a year for them to even do the trial and took even longer for them to do the sentencing.
What will that be like if the sentencing is not 30 years? What will you feel? What do you think the community, how do you think the community will react?
I feel like the community will feel like everything we did for this year by building forts, getting shot by bullets, getting mace, getting pepper spray, all that stuff, it'd be for like nothing, because it was just the first step to get him convicted. It'd be the second step to put him away for the time that he deserves.
Alexis, you were listening in on the court today, a little bit here and there as you were talking to the other activists. You heard Derek Chauvin's mom speak and say that he was a selfless man, that he was compassionate, that he's a good man. What is your response to that? What were your thoughts when you heard that?
Well, my response was, first, his mom have not even came on TV, have not been at the courtroom to support him the whole trial. It was nobody that really came to support Chauvin until the very end. And for his mom to just speak upon now that he's getting sentencing, I feel like she just wants pity on him when she could have been apologized to the family when it first happened, and just not right now.
Thank you, Alexis, so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'll send things back to you in the studio. Libby.
Joyce Coe, thank you. Mary Beth Albright, what are the next steps here? What are we watching for Judge Cahill to do in the coming moments?
Well, Judge Cahill is going to decide exactly what we have been talking about this whole time, which is what are the consequences to Derek Chauvin for murdering George Floyd. We've seen for the past 14 months, the consequences for the country We've seen the consequences on in our cities. We've seen the consequences all over the country, and now we're going to find out what those consequences are for Derek Chauvin. A couple of things that I thought were really interesting. One was, in addition to the quote that you played by Derek Chauvin's mother, Philanese Floyd. This quote, I think we're going to hear a lot of. My family and I have been given a life sentence. When you put that together with Carolyn Palenti's statement, when you sentence my son, you will also be sentencing me, I think it really highlights the tragedy of this case. There's no winning this case. And so what Judge Cahill is doing right now is sitting in back, thinking about the pre-sentencing investigation that talks about Derek Chauvin's life and his contribution to the community prior to him murdering George Floyd. He's thinking about those victim impact statements, including from George Floyd's daughter. And he's balancing that with the sentencing guidelines, which are guidelines that's been given to him by the Minnesota legislature, saying this is what we recommend. Now, something very important is that the judge can impose whatever sentence he wants, but on appeal, it has to be a lawful sentence, right? So yes, you can just give him probation. Yes, you can give him more than 30 years, but that sentence will be appealed if it's not thought of to be lawful. So he's bringing all those things into account, sitting in his chambers and thinking to himself, what is the right sentence? What is the right debt for Derek Chauvin to pay for his murder?
Mary Beth, we heard the prosecutors, Matthew Frank in particular, talk about what they believe are the aggregating factors, these reasons why the judge should go beyond what might be sort of the typical range of a sentence. And they went through what those factors were. I want you to talk about those with us. And also, it seemed like he was being very careful to say that they don't overlap, but they come together, because in the sense overlapping might sort of make them a little less potent. But he's saying that they all kind of knit together to fortify his case that Derek Chauvin should get 30 years in jail.
Well, one thing was clear in the oral art in the discussions that both the state and Chauvin's lawyer gave. Both of them believe that this is not the typical second-degree murder. Both of them believe that this is not the typical offender, right? The typical murderer. Which side do you think that falls on? Whether that is for an upward sentence, which is for greater than the sentencing guidelines, or whether that is for a downward sentence, which is lower than the sentencing guideline. It was interesting to me that the state really chose to focus on those four factors, to get really granular about the events of that day, and the four factors being the abuse of authority. One of the things that he talked about was you had custody without care, right? That you had this man in custody, but you weren't giving the duty of care to him. Another one was the particular cruelty of the crime. This gave the state an opportunity to talk more about just how awful it is to be choked to death while you're lying on the ground and while your face is being rammed into the pavement. The third is that there were children present. There was a 9-year-old present. And it's interesting because at one point, Eric Nelson, in one of his briefs, said, Derek Chauvin's attorney said, well, they could have left. And, Judge Cahill didn't even recognize that argument.
I mean, just to pause you there, in other words, Eric, the attorney for Derek Chauvin was trying to say, look, this isn't like a gunman holding people hostage or shooting someone in front of their children or something, that these were passersby unrelated to George Floyd who could have left. But we don't get a sense that the judge buys that.
We know that the judge didn't buy that because he has already issued a ruling saying that these four factors applied, that there were children present. He's not even talking about, like, these are things that call for an aggravated sentence. The judge has already said, yes, these four things were present, and so there's going to be an aggravated sentence.
And I cut you off from the fourth one, so give us the fourth one.
The fourth one is that there were 3 or more people participating with the offender. And so it gives sort of, the idea, it gives the idea of a mob mentality. And so any one of these 4 aggravating factors is enough to give a double sentence. We have 4 factors, not just 1, 4. And so that's what the state was really honing in on, that we really need a 30-year sentence. That was their argument.
Rhonda, we're cognizant of the fact that there is a federal case pending, but Judge Cahill, this is his courtroom, right? This is his jurisdiction. This is what he is looking at and experiencing. So as we saw Derek Chauvin essentially not give much of a statement at all of remorse or defending himself or justification or anything, he was alluding to the federal charges against him. But that's all well and good for Derek Chauvin. That's not the jurisdiction of Judge Cahill. That doesn't help Judge Cahill in any way.
Right. And today is about Judge Cahill's sentencing on these state charges. So that's his job, that's his jurisdiction, that's what he's going to get done in a matter of moments. But that federal case does linger over this. We saw Derek Chauvin made his first court appearance on June 1st, virtually in federal court for the beginning of that trial. So that does hang overhead here. But right now, what we're waiting on is Judge Cahill to make a decision based on these state charges. So from what we've read from people who know Judge Cahill and his thinking, he may fall somewhere in the middle. There's also another important case that I don't think we've talked about. It happened with another Minneapolis police officer a few years ago. His name was Mohammed Noor, and he shot an Australian woman who called. She reported that she was hearing sounds that sounded like a sexual assault near her home, and she was shot by this officer. Now, a couple years ago, he was charged with murder and convicted, and he got a sentence of 12 and a half years. So if there is any sort of framework or any crystal ball we could look at, it could be that case.
All right, Rhonda, let's go now back to the courtroom and Judge
Session
Cahill.
on the record. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank everybody for being here and for providing the input you did. Not just the people who were in the courtroom here, but also those who provided written statements, both from the Floyd family and the defendant's family. I've read all the impact statements that were submitted earlier and listened carefully to all the input here today. And it is truly appreciated that you took the time to stay with this case and to provide me with input. I have reviewed the pre-sentence investigation and carefully considered all the facts of the case and the law, but my comments are actually going to be very brief because most of it's going to be in writing. I have a 22-page memorandum that is going to be attached to the sentencing order. And why am I doing it in writing? To emphasize the fact that determining the appropriate sentence in any case, and in this case, is a legal analysis. It's applying the rule of law to the facts of an individual and specific case. And that is why, as opposed to trying to being profound here on the record, I prefer that you read the legal analysis that explains how I determine the sentence in this case. What the case is, or what the sentence is not based on, is emotion or sympathy. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge the deep and tremendous pain that all the families are feeling, especially the Floyd family. You have our sympathies. And I acknowledge and hear the pain that you are feeling. I acknowledge the pain not only of those in this courtroom, but the Floyd family who are outside this courtroom and other members of the community. It has been painful throughout Hennepin County, throughout the state of Minnesota, and even the country. But most importantly, we need to recognize the pain of the Floyd family. I'm not going to attempt to be profound or clever because it's not the appropriate time. I'm not basing my sentence also on public opinion. I'm not basing it on any attempt to send any messages. A trial court judge, the job of a trial court judge is to apply the law to specific facts and to deal with individual cases. And so, Mr. Chauvin, as to count one, based on the verdict of the jury, finding you guilty of unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony under Minnesota Statute 609.19 subdivision 2 paren 1. It is the judgment of the court that you now stand convicted of that offense. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute section 609.04, counts 2 and 3 will remain unadjudicated as they are lesser offenses of count 1. As sentenced for count 1, the court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270. That is a 10-year addition to the presumptive sentence of 150 months. This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd. You're granted credit for 199 days already served. Pay the mandatory surcharge of $78 to be paid from prison wages. You're prohibited from possessing firearms, ammunition, or explosives for the remainder of your life. Provide a DNA sample as required by law. Register as a predatory offender as required by law. And then you will receive a copy of the order and also the attached memorandum explaining the court's analysis. Anything further from the state?
If this needs to be said, we just ask that it be executed forthwith.
Defendant is remanded to the custody of the sheriff to be transported back to the DOC or whichever custody is currently holding him. Anything for the defense?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. We are adjourned.
Derek Chauvin sentenced to 22 years in prison in the killing of George Floyd. That is above what would be a typical sentence for this crime, but the judge agreed with prosecutors that there were aggravating factors that added to the time. He said that Derek Chauvin gets credit for the 199 days already served, but he now faces this lengthy prison sentence of 22 years, not the 30 years that prosecutors had requested, but still longer than what would be typical. Mary Beth Albright, let's go to you for some legal context on this sentence.
Well, I did think it was interesting that Judge Cahill said this is not based on emotion. This is not based on sympathy. And I am giving you a 22-page opinion that I have written that is going into the record. They have not posted that yet on the Minnesota court's website. As soon as they do, we will take a look at that. But I thought it was interesting that he reiterated that the role of a judge is to apply the law to specific facts. It's not to send messages about anything to anyone. It's just to give that sentence. And so he really did focus on the law, and I really looking forward is not the right way to put it, but I'm very interested to read that 22-page report that he put out. And of note, he said that the aggravated sentence that he gave, because this is a higher sentencing than the guidelines would ask for, is abuse of authority and the particular cruelty of the crime of the murder of George Floyd. So that's what we're going to take a look for when we read that opinion. Libby?